Hello and welcome to Thinkpod, powered by the FII Institute. I'm your host, Mark Barton, and for over 2 decades, I've been at the forefront of global conversations on the issues that matter the most. In this series, I'll be meeting the leaders who are rising to tackle the grand challenges that face humanity right now. Together, we'll be discussing the radical ideas and the transformative solutions that'll benefit both people and planet. This episode, I'm joined by Rishi Kapoor, Co-Chief Executive Officer at Investcorp. We talk inclusion, decarbonisation, and whether investors should fear for their returns if they invest in ESG. Rishi, thank you very much for joining me today.
It's an absolute pleasure, Mark.
Now, the backdrop of this conversation takes place amidst fractures geopolitically, climate, economically as well. How are you traversing the terrain?
Yeah, no, I think, well, you framed it right. Certainly, as you think about the current market backdrop, it's not the same for the next 2 years that we can expect that we encountered the last few years, right? That bit is certain. You know, very few certainties in financial markets, but the one bit that is certain is that we are looking ahead at an uncertain geopolitical backdrop. But more importantly, as financial market investors, we are looking ahead at an inflation and interest rate regime that is very different from what all of us have experienced and frankly benefited from over the course of the last 10 years.
And many have never experienced it.
Yeah.
Have they? That's the point, isn't it?
I'll tell you a funny anecdote on that.
Yeah.
Right? Last year, we hired 100 people at Investcorp. 100 new people joined Investcorp, and I'm going to mention something else over here. I'm proud of the fact that 50 of those were women.
Brilliant.
But aside from that, the average age of the 100 people that we hired is less than my tenure at Investcorp. So to your point, many of those people were not even born when I joined Investcorp, leave alone, them recognizing what a high interest rate, high inflation regime looks like, right?
Yeah.
So for them, this is a very new investment environment. And this is the new generation that is going to be entrusted with the deployment and the management of capital going forward.
What are the challenges of deploying and managing capital in that new environment? High inflation, potentially low or negative growth?
I'll take it asset class by asset
Yeah.
class, right? Because it's always better not to try and take a one-size-fits-all approach. So let's take the ones that are benefiting. We are big investors in private credit. Most private credit tends to be floating rate based. It was very difficult for private credit to generate high absolute returns in the last several years, more than a decade in fact, when interest rates were virtually zero. But now interest rates, base rates, expected to be at 2.5-3%, means that you have an absolute bump of 2.5 to 3% in returns that you can deliver on private credit. Now, having said that, in the face of an uncertain economic environment, right? Let us not kid ourselves. In an attempt to contain the levels of inflation that we are currently experiencing, particularly in the developed economies, in the US and in Western Europe, where we are very active, naturally, the central banks are going to make sure that they continue to keep tightening financial conditions, not just through interest rate hikes, but through quantitative tightening, through just sheer job owning, if you will.
Which in itself will affect the credit market.
Exactly. So,
Yeah.
the outlook for weaker credits that could earlier survive on very easy monetary and financing conditions is not that great. So I temper my earlier enthusiasm for higher absolute returns expected from floating rate credit with a caveat that you need to have good credit selection skills. Experience, going back to our earlier conversation, is going to make a difference. Selecting the right industries,
Which are?
acyclical, long-term secular trends that can be tapped into, for example, digitization, healthcare and wellness focus, anything that is linked to providing innovative solutions to the biggest challenges of today, particularly sustainability and climate
which
change.
we're going to come to, of course.
Absolutely.
So outside of private credit, you obviously focus in a number of other areas.
That's
ripple
true.
across those as well in the outlook.
Let's go to private equity next. Private equity relies, at least in the buyout segment, where we are very active again on a transatlantic basis, relies on the use of leverage. So on one hand, the cost of that leverage is going to go up because interest rates are going to be higher. On the other hand, to the extent there is a bit of an inflationary impulse in the underlying markets, companies that have some pricing power and the ability to push that price down into their ultimate consumers or customers actually are going to benefit on a net basis. Because what you find is typically there may be a lag a little bit between the cost of your primary inputs, whether it's raw materials or wages or even interest cost in the case of a leveraged investment going up, and the pass-through to consumers. But once it does happen, effectively the nominal value of the debt stays the same, but your top line is that much higher, your EBITDA is that much higher. So your value creation potential automatically magnifies as a consequence. So private equity in the long run ought to benefit. And then within real estate, again, actually this is a bit of a healthy correction, frankly, right? Because in real estate, particularly in the developed markets and in the sectors that are attracting a lot of capital, which is anything to do with warehousing, logistics, industrial assets, et cetera, last mile distribution, and then in the US, anything to do with multifamily housing, the levels of cap rates, which is effectively the inverse of the multiple, had descended to kind of absolute numbers that frankly in the long run didn't really make any sense anymore. With a higher base interest rate environment expected for the near to medium term, what is likely to happen is that there is going to be an adjustment in the cap rates going forward.
Yeah.
Very specifically, what we are going to see is asset classes within real estate where the underlying lease term is long are going to have a bit of a valuation adjustment downwards because the landlords of those assets have very limited ability to reset the rents. So you're locked into an existing rent in the face of an inflationary environment, but the interest rates are going up. So your spread is going to squeeze, right, for a very long period of time. If you're an office tenant, for example, you have a 10-year lease, you're paying your rent for the next 10 years at the current level. But underlying inflation has gone up, rents ought to have gone up, cost of debt has gone up for the landlord on the mortgage, and the spread has decreased. Other businesses within real estate, like multifamily housing, where there is an annual rent reset, fantastic, right? Because you can actually reset the rent to the market level, which in turn tracks inflation every year. So there, actually, we are probably going to see a much less adverse impact and basically a degree of stability in terms of capital flows, both from investors and allocators.
Rishi, let's talk about responsible investing. You released not too long ago your responsible business report. What does it mean to you? What's your corporate responsibility? What does corporate responsibility mean to you? And do you get a sense that firms feel obligated now to act responsibly?
To me, this whole idea of having a different seeming asset class called ESG investing is a little naive, right? There is no such thing. ESG investing may have been an asset class in the past. It is not an asset class for the future. And the reason for that is all investing will have to take into account ESG as a core objective, just like they take into account risk and return, right? All investing is about delivering a return at a manageable level of risk, and ESG is going to be part and parcel.
So you're critical of the label.
Not just that. I am actually saying something much more than that. I'm saying the following. I'm saying you as an investor, we Investcorp, have to embrace the fact that part of our DNA is all about delivering those investment opportunities to our stakeholders in a manner that is responsible towards our employees, that is responsible towards our portfolio companies, the investments that we own, and that is responsible towards the communities that we operate within and that we serve, right? And there is no stepping away from that fact. And that's why we actually call it the responsibility ecosystem. The E, C, and O is for responsible employer, responsible citizen, and responsible operator.
This is your DNA. This is
the DNA.
Investment philosophy.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
And everything that we do has to follow that philosophy.
Should investors worry about sacrificing returns when putting money into companies that invest in ESG?
Naturally, there's potential for some short-term increase in costs, right? And that is where I love the fact that we are a private equity investor, not a public markets investor. And the reason why I love that fact is we have two benefits. One is the companies and the assets that we invest into, typically we have a very significant influence over, but more importantly, we have the benefit of a long-term investment horizon, where we can work with those companies and their management teams to map out a journey which takes them from A to B, because the entire world is on that same journey, right? They are no different. Map that journey out and then help them, meet the interim milestones on that journey. If I were to invest in a private equity asset today, there are going to be a number of areas where we will potentially invest capital, some additional expense, to create long-term sustainable value. This is one more of those. It doesn't bother us one bit. It doesn't bother our investors one bit. They understand that the value of sustainable long-term investment is actually significantly higher than the minor increase in cost that may be incurred in the interim. It's a little bit like a J-curve. You go like this, and then it goes like this.
You've clearly committed to increasing your ESG efforts, particularly with regards to decarbonization, across your investments. So let's walk the walk. What progress are you making in this area specifically? And, what needs to be done? What more needs to be done?
So what we've done already is we've kind of mapped out the Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions for ourselves as a corporate. Investcorp, the thing about Investcorp, as you can understand, is we are a corporate in our own right, but we own or control or significantly influence at least 50 other companies that are in our private equity portfolio at any given point in time, not necessarily the same companies at all points in time, because we acquire and we exit, we acquire and we exit. So we've mapped out Scope 1, Scope 2 for ourselves, and we are also working on developing a clearly outlined pathway to a net zero footprint for Investcorp over the course of the next 10 years, by the end of this decade, hopefully. The same thing we have started instituting within our portfolio companies. Now, it's very likely, Mark, that 5 years from now, the 50 that are in my portfolio today will probably not be there in my portfolio. They'll probably be owned by someone else, right? But it is our job to assess what their current status is, what their current starting point is, establish what they want to be able to get to within the next 10 years, and put them on that journey, right?
Let's talk about inclusion, because you've been ranked in the top 5, globally that is, among the most inclusive firms. That's across the private equity and the venture capital space. What does diversity, what does inclusion mean to you? And why is it so important?
So, I'm not going to cite the multiple studies that have already been conducted by everyone from Harvard and many of the other universities and consulting firms, etc., that have clearly established the fact that diversity of opinion around the proverbial table leads to better decision making, more informed decision making, better decision making, more holistic assessment of the risks and the opportunities around any particular investment. Now, we are in that business. That is our business, right? We are faced with the opportunity to decide whether we want to buy, hold, or sell an existing investment or a prospective new investment virtually every day of our lives. And having that diversity of opinion around the table, we have come to appreciate through our 40 years of history, has been a meaningful contributor towards that. I couldn't be more proud of the fact that just in the last year alone, and I was saying this to you earlier, of the 100-odd people that we hired at Investcorp, 50 of them were women. But more importantly, out of the 480 people that we have at Investcorp today, we have 47 nationalities represented across that. It's a mini United Nations. We are only present in 13 countries, but we have people from 47 countries across the length and breadth of the firm today. Ethnic diversity, gender diversity, the regions that we come from has led in no small measure to some of the success that we have experienced to date. The other thing I have to say again that is a matter of pride for us is we are amongst the pioneers in the space of setting up an actual dedicated vehicle to invest in and to seed alternative asset managers from diverse backgrounds.
According to a report by Knight Foundation, the overall percentage of assets under management controlled by diverse-owned firms was only 1.4%.
That was what I was getting
Yeah,
at, right?
I'm stealing your thunder.
no, but it's less than 1.5% of the total AUM represented by managers that are from diverse backgrounds.
So how are you going to change that figure? How are you going to get that figure up like this?
Well, by leaning in behind
Yeah.
it. We are, like I said earlier, we are, not just talking the talk, we are walking it too.
You are. You've got a policy that requires 50% of all shortlisted candidates to come from diverse backgrounds. Quotas alone, are they the answer to fixing diversity? I mean, how are you ensuring that employees from diverse backgrounds have a voice at all levels of the company?
I think you're absolutely right. Quotas are not the fix over here. Quotas can probably get you started, shine the spotlight, if you will, but that's not the way to change behavior and culture. And what we are more focused on, frankly, inside of Investcorp is precisely that latter bit. So what we've done is, at all levels inside the firm, we've imparted training, including to myself, right, around unconscious biases, right? Just understanding not just the benefits of diversity, but also understanding that we as human beings do have certain cognitive biases unconsciously, and we need to be able to be aware of them and overcome them, right? When we are looking to hire, let's not hire the person that looks like you. Let's hire the person that looks exactly the opposite of you, number one. Number two, we have embedded into our annual appraisals a clear, segment around each individual's commitment to and deliverable against ESG and diversity and inclusion, right? And we assess that. So each individual is assessed in terms of their actions as to how they contributed to those two agendas.
Rishi, I want to finish with your place of birth. India, your country of birth, which I know you're passionate about for obvious reasons. Tell us about the current state of responsible investing in India and the outlook.
Yeah, no, you're right. India is where I was born, and for the first 35 years of Investcorp's own investing journey, we had been focused 100% on the developed markets on a transatlantic basis between Western Europe and US. So India for Investcorp itself is a relatively new market, right? And it has been a new lens, for me to have to put on when I look at India beyond just my birthplace, but as a market that we are actively investing into. And the two or three things that became very clear as we were looking at our obligation to our investment business in India as a responsible investor is, it's clearly not one size fits all. The pressing needs in India for the consumers, for the businesses, for the communities that we operate within are not just about the climate. I'm not going to ignore the climate because it is, look, I just came from Mumbai. It was hot, but it's also about inclusion, better human and labor practices, governance, training and development, lives and livelihood, right? Employability. I mean, and some of the stuff that we have focused on as a consequence in India is very much around those particular elements of what will create the foundation for a long-term sustainable and thriving economy, right? There are millions of people every year coming out of poverty in India and entering the middle class and seeking access to reasonable quality of goods and services at an affordable price point. And if we can invest in businesses that in fact does provide precisely that, we have delivered on our purpose. So let me take a couple of examples. We are the largest investor in the single largest private dialysis chain in India called NephroPlus, right? It's actually amongst the top 5 largest private dialysis chains in the world. NephroPlus provides 1.7 million dialysis treatments a year on average and growing, right? But let's ask what's unique about NephroPlus. Their price per treatment is one-eighth of the price that you would pay in the UK or in any developed part of the world. That is inclusive. That is providing an essential service to a community that is currently, supply starved on that front at an affordable price point, right? There's another company we invested into in India called Fresh to Home. Fresh to Home is a technology-enabled e-grocer for all practical purposes. They provide basically fresh seafood and meat all over India. But the way they do it is they have basically looked at the fishermen, the unorganized fishermen across the coastal towns of India, of which there are 3,000 kilometers worth, right? And they have cut out the middlemen. And they have, as a consequence, created employment and meaningful livelihood gains for 17,000 people in India by allowing the fishermen to be able to access the best price for his or her catch on a daily basis using their mobile phone, and being able to participate in the auctions as opposed to getting ripped off, and being able to get their supply to the plate on the proverbial dinner table in less than 24 hours. That the amount of reduction in waste simply through that efficiency that has happened is so meaningful you cannot even begin to quantify it. There is a 15% reduction in waste, right, as a consequence. Think about that, right? So the fisherman is not paying an intermediary and has a 15% less waste. So the improvement in their livelihoods and their ability to serve their families is meaningful. The final point I'm going to make over here, which we started picking up in India, but actually in my humble mind is actually one of the top 3 investment opportunities and themes going forward, is around decarbonization.
Yeah.
Right? That whole journey towards energy transition, but more importantly, companies that are going to provide technical, innovative solutions to consumers and businesses to help them on their journey towards a lower greenhouse gas emission, lower carbon footprint, is probably one of the most compelling investment themes that we are going to have in front of us for the next 30 years. And that's where we want to lean in big time, because that's what we know how to do, right? We know how to invest in companies that in turn are servicing consumers and businesses with respect to services or products that they need, right? And what the consumers and businesses need is innovative technical solutions that bridge the transition from today to 2050 or 2070, whichever.
There is no better place to finish this interview than on the transition and decarbonization. Rishi, thank you so much
You're
for
welcome.
your time.
It's
That
an
was
absolute
absolutely
pleasure.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. In these turbulent times, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe to ThinkPod for more insight and analysis.